Good morning.
Please introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name is Eric Ewell. I'm here on behalf of Deb Wigand this morning. And just preliminarily, if I may, Senator Kane, procedurally, under Title III, Section 455, relating to testimony by witness under subpoena, provides that if the witness or his counsel objects to a decision to televise, film, or broadcast his testimony shall not be televised, filmed, or broadcast, and we would like to make that request at this time.
Thank you. Just give me one moment. I am familiar with that portion of the statute. We had thought about that today. Linda Pisner, could you weigh in with us?
Linda Pisner with the Office of the Attorney General. That statute does say that. We spent some time looking at the legal history, the legislative history of that provision, and the fact that it's not consistent with the Freedom of Access law. As it turns out, the two chapters were being enacted by the same legislature. There was an effort on the part of some wise legislator to clarify the interface of those two provisions that was not accepted. So what we have are two statutes that are not necessarily consistent. On its face, that statute doesn't cover folks that are in the room, so it's not very logical to yield to the investigating committee statute as opposed to the Freedom of Access law in that regard. So our advice has been to the committee that it's more consistent to allow the broadcast in the audio that comes through the links here today. Any further questions or position to take on that, you're free to address that.
Did you have any additional comments?
Well, I only know what the statute says. I didn't have the advantage of having the Attorney General's opinion. So it sounds like what you're saying, Linda, is that your office has looked into this, and your conclusion is that this statute is inconsistent with Title I, and therefore it's preempted?
I think maybe a clearer way to put that is that statute has application when there's executive session, is the most reasonable way to read it. Then that way you can read this section consistent with the FOA and not have a preemption or a conflict.
I guess I would just add that if something is an executive session, it's necessarily not going to be televised. So for what it's worth, I don't sound like, doesn't sound like I'm going to be able to change your mind, but if something's an executive session, necessarily it's not televised or broadcast. So I really think it makes sense to say it applies to executive session. Seems like on its face it has to apply to a public session. Those are the only comments I have.
Thank you. Thank you for raising the issue. We did try to anticipate that kind of, tried to look through the statute because we are in a place where some of the areas are not exactly aligned. We are, as we start today, we need to start with the swearing in and the oath. Linda, doing the oath. There it is. I have it. Just a second. I need the motion sheet that you took. Thank you. Thank you. We'll start with the oath, and that is administered by the chair. Deb, please raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Ms. Beal, could you turn the microphone on, please?
Sorry. I do.
Thank you very much. I'd ask that you would provide any records at this time that you may have brought with you in accordance with the subpoena.
Yes. When I had an interview, I provided records. What I brought with me today is the report that you've written, as well as an appendix piece to one of your minutes that has an alleged timeline.
Those are the OPEGA documents. There's been no changes to those. The ones that you have, those are just, there's no new information there.
They're printed from
Great.
computer.
Okay, that's perfect.
And a blank piece of paper.
Great. And otherwise, everything you had that we would want would have come before us already through the office.
It is my understanding, yes.
Great. Thank you very much. We're now going to take testimony and questions. As we said, The questions will be done by the chairs and the leads. I'll start with just some basic questions. So could you please just tell us your title at the CDC and how long you've worked there?
Yes. My title is Director, Division of Population Health. I have worked at the Maine CDC since 1999.
Great. And are you familiar and have you recently familiarized yourself with the OPEGA report from December?
I have read the report, yes.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to look to my colleagues to see if anyone in particular would like to begin with questions today. Senator Cates?
Thanks.
Swaggin, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
I'd like to ask you, if you can, your knowledge of several different areas. One is the whole decision about whether to use an RFP here in the selection of who the 8 leads were going to be, the 8 lead agencies. And as I understand it, in 2011, the fund received about $7.8 million in financing from the legislature. And then in December, when the new governor took office, his proposal called for about a 75% reduction in funding. Is that your recollection? Do you know?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Would you like me to clarify,
Sure.
or do you want me to?
Please go ahead.
We did have an RFP, and you're right, it was about $7.8 million in this specific account, but the governor's budget did not, I don't believe, cut it by 75%. What happened in the governor's budget is that the fund was zeroed out except for personal services and a small amount of all other, which related to the indirect that would be needed for those personal services. So in the all other line, which is appropriate to use for contracts, etc., there was no money at all.
Okay. But some funding was going to be available going forward?
The funding that was available was for personnel that was paid for out of that line.
All right.
We have no ability to use that money for other than personnel. That's
Yep.
the sort of rules about how we use our funds.
Okay. And there were, and still are, I guess, 27 of these Healthy Maine Partnership sites around the state. Is that right?
Yes, that is true.
And am I correct that in January of 2012 that your staff began discussing the possibility of reducing those 27 down to 9? Is that right?
In January of 2012, I guess that was, there is the 07 line, which is community school grants and statewide coordination, which, as we just said, had no money, which paid for the 27 Healthy Maine partnerships as well as a few other things. And there's also an 08 line, which is public health infrastructure, which has about $1.2 million. We still had the 08 $1.2 million. That was not reduced in any way. So we had funds to pay Healthy Maine partnerships, but all we had was $1.2 million. So we needed to think about, if the budget went through with a cut, what would we do with $1.2 million? When we divided that out, it didn't appear to make sense to fund 27 Healthy Maine partnerships. So we considered looking at funding districts instead, because the new public health districts had happened over the course of the last several years.
Right. So there was discussion about going down to a total of from 27 to 9 if the budget passed as the chief executive had suggested.
Yes.
Okay. And in February, I know some people from your office met with DAFs, with the Department of Administration and Financial Services, to talk about the proper process where you would go from 27 to 9. Is that right?
I believe it is, because it's stated and it makes sense. I don't recall that I was a part of that.
Okay, fair enough. And in April of 2012, and I'm not sure if you were involved in this, it's our understanding that a core group began to meet to figure out how the process would move forward to go from 27 to 9. Were you part of that core group?
Yes, I was.
Okay. Now, eventually, in May of 2012, the legislature decided to cut funding for the Fund for Healthy Maine, but not by nearly as much as the chief executive had originally suggested, right?
Yes, that's true.
And instead of being cut by most of it, it was cut by about a third. Is that fair?
Yes.
And most of that cut of that one-third cut was by eliminating these school-based programs. Is that correct?
When we looked at the cut, we wanted to try to preserve as much as possible the ability for the communities to have high impact, and looking at the amount of school health coordinators in comparison to the amount of school districts, so basically 31 versus 164 or 140 some, it sort of varies, we determined that it was probably wiser for us to fund the communities at the maximum amount we could,
right,
and ask the communities to address school pieces, knowing that it wouldn't be the same as a school health coordinator, but they could offer certainly some look at how to impact tobacco use, physical activity, and nutrition.
Sure, and I'm not questioning that decision, but essentially the school health coordinators were cut out.
Yes, they were.
Right, and when that $2 million was cut out, the actual reduction to the fund, to the Healthy Maine partnerships was only about $700,000 system-wide. Am I doing the math right?
I wouldn't be able to confirm that. I don't have that at the top of my head.
Well, I think that there was a reduction from $7.5 million to $4.7 million, and of that $2.8 million reduction, 2.1 of that was cutting the school health coordinators, I believe. So if you'll accept the math for a minute, it looks to go at the end of this that the Healthy Maine partnerships themselves were only down about $700,000 in funding from where they had previously been. Do you know?
I really can't say.
Okay.
I don't remember.
But in any event, the cut in funding was much less significant than had been anticipated or worried about, if you will, when the chief executive first offered his budget. Fair enough?
The funding was less. The funding was less, yes.
Do you know why it was that a decision was not made at that point to say we now can just reduce funding by 8% to each of these folks and maybe do an RFP if we want to do further consolidation later? Were you part of any discussions about that?
Let me see if I understand what you're saying. I believe what you're saying is that when the budget passed in the middle of May, we should have done an RFP, which takes 6 months to a year in this, for this type of an RFP, because we also have substance abuse and mental health services as part of our Healthy Maine Partnership funding, which is separate federal funding. And the contract needed to start July 1st.
Sure.
So basically, from the end of May until July 1st, we didn't even have enough time to encumber a contract on time, because we're required to have 6 to 8 weeks to encumber a contract. So it was virtually impossible to have an RFP. That wasn't really a solution.
Right, and I don't disagree with you, and I didn't ask that question very well. Let me put it a different way.
Okay.
There was some talk about reducing the number of Healthy Maine partnerships, or at that point about going to 9 leads and keeping all 27 of them. And my question is, and I don't know this would have been a good thing or not, I'm just wondering if it was discussed. Okay, for this next year, let's just cut each of those 27 by 8%. And then if we want to move to a reduction from 27 to 9 in the following year, we'll have plenty of time to do a more transparent request for proposals process for the following year. And my question is, was that option discussed to your knowledge?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know who made the decision to go to 9. I can't really say.
Okay. Ms. Wigand, can you tell us, this core group came up with certain scoring criteria for the process by which the 27 HMPs would be reduced to 9, right?
In April, there were a few people who came together to brainstorm ideas for how we might look at the Healthy Maine partnerships and ensure that they're doing efficient, effective work. And criteria were talked about and evolved over time. In April, we didn't know whether there was funding or there wasn't funding, so I would say sort of yes and no. That I think the purpose became more clear, or you could say changed or evolved over time when we had an actual budget.
Okay. Once you had an actual budget and knew what amount you were dealing with, there was a decision made to come up with scoring criteria by which you would all decide which of the 27 were going to become leads, one of the 8. Is that fair?
Yes.
Because even though you didn't have time for an RFP, you certainly wanted a definable scoring system so that everyone would be treated fairly.
Yes.
Right? And as a result of that process, there was a set of criteria that were developed by which all 27 of the existing Healthy Maine partnerships would be judged in deciding how to shrink down to 9, right?
Yes.
And am I correct that those criteria which were approved, that none of them were weighted more than any other, at least in the initial scoring round?
I think it would be fair to say that when we looked at criteria, we thought about what data was available, what might make sense to try to get to the types of values that we were trying to move forward with. And so, sorry, I lost track of what you had asked.
Well, yeah, my question was, I know that the core group eventually came up with a list of specific criteria by which all 27 of the Healthy Maine partnerships would be scored in trying to figure out which ones were going to win it down to 9.
It's about weighting. Okay.
Right, and so the question was there was no weighting at the beginning of that process. No criterion was given more weight than any other. Am I correct about that?
No, I think there was a discussion about what criteria might be used. So weighting didn't enter into it at that time.
Okay. Well, eventually, there was a scoring sheet made up about how each of these Healthy Maine partnerships performed under the various criteria. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And if I can move ahead to a meeting on June 6th, it's my understanding that the core group discussed those criteria in that scoring at that June 6th meeting. Is that right?
I couldn't say. I was not at that meeting. I was actually out of the state.
Okay. Am I right? You were actually on vacation from June, a well-earned vacation, I'm sure, from June 6th to June 6th to June 16th.
Yes, through the 16th.
Okay, so you weren't, any things that happened during those days you were not part of?
No.
Okay.
No, I did not keep track of work.
Okay. All right. Before you left, had you seen or were you aware of the final scoring criteria that had been arrived at by the core group?
I don't know. I was aware of having criteria that were analyzed, but I can't say whether I knew what the final scoring was at that time.
Okay. Were you, as of the day you left for vacation on the end of June 5th, to your recollection, were any of those criteria weighted more heavily than any of the other criteria in the scoring?
I don't know.
Okay. So you returned on June 16, as I understand it. Is that correct? Or 17th?
I returned to work on the 18th. That was Monday.
Okay. After you returned, were you part of any discussions that talked about the fact that the criteria had changed, that any new criteria had been added, or that new weightings had been applied to any criteria?
I actually recall no discussions really about the criteria.
Okay. All right. Let me ask you then, move on to another area. Well, a couple other questions. Were you, there was a criteria that later was applied called support and promotion and development of infrastructure. Support for promotion and development of infrastructure. Are you familiar with that criteria that was actually used later on?
I'm not familiar with specific criteria.
Let me ask you, if I could now, about documents. When you returned on June 18 to work. Were you ever asked to destroy any documents which existed as a result of the process you had been through?
I have not been asked to destroy documents.
Okay. Have you ever asked, and did you ever ask anyone to shred, destroy, or get rid of any documents?
No, I did not.
Did you become aware that someone else may have asked another person to do so?
Yes.
Okay, and can you tell us how and when you became aware of that?
I cannot give you the specific date. I can remember sort of how it felt or what it was. I went to, I suppose I'm supposed to say names.
Mm-hmm.
Please.
Yes, that's okay.
I went to Andy Finch's desk because there was something I wanted to check in with him about. I don't remember what that conversation was. As I was standing at his desk and we had finished that discourse, he said to me, "Deb, there's something I need to tell you." I was asked to destroy documents. I wasn't comfortable doing it, and I didn't do it. And he said, I left the meeting, and I hadn't said I would or wouldn't, but I knew that that's not something I wanted to do. And I said, I think you need to do what you think is right, what you need to do. And that is basically, as I remember it, all I said. I understand that people feel critical of why I didn't pursue that. I saw it as he was informing me of something that had happened. He made a decision and acted the way he wanted that decision to be. And if his decision was to not destroy documents and he still had the documents, then I didn't see a point in bringing up anything beyond that. He had his documents, I understood, and me saying that to him was my way of saying, I'm not going to ask you to destroy these documents. You need to do what you feel is appropriate. I think we each need to have our own compass as to how we act.
Okay. Did anybody